Oh God. I know I'm about to get flamed for this opinion because the fandom is pretty divisive about this particular debate. But I'm sorry, I have to get this off my chest. I believe firmly that whilst Barney is a creep and a menace to the women of New York, Theodore Evelyn Mosby is a bigger menace who wreaks way more havoc on these women than Barney could ever hope to accomplish. And hopefully, by the time you're done watching this video, you'll be able to see where I am coming from and why I have this opinion, even if you don't necessarily agree with me. So be kind in the comments, please. Now, before I get into all of that, and just in case this is your first time stumbling on one of my videos or on my channel, hello, I'm Noria, and I'm currently in the middle of my first time ever watch of How I Met Your Mother. And no, you did not hear that wrong. This is my first time ever watch of the show. I didn't quite get around to catching it whilst it aired and have been able to stay away from spoilers because I just avoided the spaces where the show was being discussed. As such, if you want to make any comments about anything I state in this video that might seem spoilery, please tag it as spoilers ahead and put a ton of asterisks before you start with your comment. So I have to click read more to get to that. I won't, of course, but everyone else who's seen the show can do so and you all can chat away in the comments. Now, for those of you who are probably like, Noria, girl, this is your first time watching this show and you haven't even finished it yet. So how can you state unequivocally that Ted is worse than Barney? Your Ted disdain is bleeding through. Plus, it's clear that you also have a bias for Neil Patrick Harris. And you know what? Fair points to both. I think Neil Patrick Harris is amazing, and I have admitted it before in previous videos and in my comments that if Barney Stinson was played by someone else, I might not give him as much of a leeway. And also, Ted has had me screaming into my pillows since he started haranguing Robin in the very first episode of season 1 after Lillian Marshall's engagement had him realizing that his metaphorical clock was ticking. However, I will like to state that I finally finished How I Met Your Mother season 3 episode 4 titled Little Boys, or as I like to call it, the episode that showed Ted for the jackass that he is. And that episode was what has me firmly in the Ted is worse than Barney camp. And when we get through what happened with the bet, my hope is that you'll be able to see my point clearly. But before I get into the synopsis of the episode, a quick thank you to my lovely patrons and YouTube members whose support have been instrumental in helping me continue to make content, especially since I've been doing this full time since the start of the year when I've been out of paid employment. And a special shout out to Lina and Holly for their extra support. You get all the hearts and kisses too. Mwah. If you too would like to support me on Patreon or become a YouTube member to enjoy certain perks, even get a shout out, the link to do so is in the description bar. And with that said, How I Met Your Mother season 3 episode 4 begins with Lily trying to gas up a potential date to Robin, painting this picture of such an incredible guy that her friends immediately point out that there must be a but in the mix, because that is often what happens when someone sounds too good to be true. But then you realize that there's a little but in there. And honestly, it's such a valid point because I immediately thought of Ted, who is otherwise a catch. He is smart, he is funny, he is witty, he is good looking, he has a good and stable job, can be quite charming, and is interestingly enough a man who is ready to commit. But that commitment is predicated on him being certain that the woman he's with is the one. And how does he judge that? By very nebulous feelings that he can't really put his finger on and which seem to ebb and flow with the tides. But sorry, I am getting ahead of myself. We will come back to this point where I'm talking about the difference between Ted and Barney's level of creep in a bit. As I was saying, Lily is selling this guy to Robin, who pulls her back with a but, and Lily admits the little fly in the ointment that would otherwise be a perfect match for her friend. The guy, George, is the father of one of her students. Spoiler alert, is the father of the little shithead that basically bullied and blackmailed Marshall in the episode where the gang was trying to avoid being spoiled about the Super Bowl finals until they watched it together. Remember the boy that basically turned Marshall into a grade school bully, but which we all cheered at because he was such a little shit? Please don't tell me you were one of the sanctimonious Marshall should have reading above it all commenters, because that little shit had it coming. But anyway, the fact that we've met this boy before should already be a foreshadowing of how things will play out for poor Robin. The poor girl has no idea what she was about to experience because Marshall wasn't there to warn her. Anyway, I am once again getting ahead of myself. Robin, despite her dislike for kids, agrees to Ted's surprise, and although she initially lies that she likes kids, she quickly caves and admits to George that she is not fond of children and doesn't get along well with them. George is like, no biggie, they don't need to rush and Robin can meet his kid later. Later, however, comes pretty quickly on a morning when Robin is in George's pajamas and in walks Doug, the little shithead, who she ends up bonding pretty quickly with, and Robin is like, looks like not all kids are bad after all. Poor Robin. This thought eventually comes back around to bite her in the ass because shortly after her connecting with Doug, Lily shows her a painting Doug had drawn in class of his new mommy, and the crew are all convinced that the drawing looks exactly like Robin. Robin, of course, does the thing she does when things are getting serious and her fear of commitment rears its ugly head. She wants to break up with George, but Lily urges her to break up with Doug as well, since the kid seems to be attached to her at this point. Robin then heads to George's apartment to do just that, only to find out that one, she's not the only woman that George is dating or having sex with, and two, she's not the new mommy that Doug drew in Lily's class. Nope, that would be Brooke, one of the other women that George has been with and whom Doug informs Robin that he had a connection with and prefers to her. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Doug doesn't even remember Robin's name. I mean, shithead, am I right? Ted does tell his kids that Robin eventually gets over her distaste for children, as they know very well, and we are treated to a pretty collage of pictures his kids drew with Auntie Robin, which are pretty cute, not gonna lie. So that is the Robin side plot in the episode. The main focus, however, is on the two dunderheads that are Barney and Ted, who, whilst at McLaren's with the poor Marshall, who it turned out was having a homoerotic conversation with a stranger in the bathroom that it thought was Ted, and who later came out to give his number to Marshall, who was pretty pleased and blushing about the fact. And I love Marshall, you all. Marshall Erickson, I will always love you. You will always be bae. Anyway, Ted and Barney are arguing about who has more game. Marshall is, of course, out of the equation because his ass is married, duh. And it's been him and Lily for the past 11 years, although the way Marshall kept trying to have himself in the running, including his pride at being hit on at McLaren's by the bathroom guy, was cute. I don't know about you all, but I am of the firm opinion that Marshall won that bet. He made some pretty salient points. I have to give it to the lawyer. Ted and Barney, meanwhile, have Marshall out of the count and instead declare that to decide who the winner would be, they would both eat on the unfortunate girl at the bar, Stacy, and whoever gets to have sex with Stacy would be the winner. Barney, being Barney, tricks Ted and rushes to meet Stacy first and gets slapped hard for his effort. He comes back to admit to Ted and Marshall that it turns out that he has had sex with Stacy in the past and she's not very happy with him. Ted crows that means that he has won and admits Barney's protestations that Ted isn't being fair since he is automatically out for the count. Ted decides to take his time with dating Stacy, who he starts to fall in love with, and Stacy, of course, also starts to fall for Ted, which we all know is a recipe for things to go so much worse, as they are apt to do with Ted. Because when Ted comes back to tell Barney that he's about to have sex with Stacy now, thus winning the bet, Barney pulls the, yeah, but you're going to get my cooties because you're having sex with a girl I've had sex with before. And would you believe it? It works on Ted, who, when he's about to get down with Stacy, just keeps seeing miniatured Barneys all over her body and breaks up with her as a result of it. And I had to pause the episode at this point and scream and punch my pillow because Theodore Evelyn Mosby, you absolute asshat. And you know what ends up being worse? It turns out that Barney had lied to Ted. He'd never had sex with Stacy before and had instead asked her to slap him the first night when they all met in order to cheer up his good friend Ted, who is having a bad time. And all the information that Ted got about Stacy's interest whilst he was dating Stacy, Barney used the info instead to position himself as someone who is perfect for Stacy, making him the perfect rebound for Stacy, who calls him after Ted broke up with her, crying and needing to be comforted. And Barney, of course, goes to her to help her pick up the pieces of her heart that Ted broke. Except her experience with Ted meant that Stacy decided to take things even slower, and 1 month after her breakup with Ted, she is still not agreed to have sex yet with a sexually frustrated Barney, who starts to see a little Ted on Stacy's body dancing in mockery of him. The end. Now, I know this episode doesn't paint Barney in the best of light, and you're probably thinking, Noria, girl, what are you saying? Barney was just as much of a terrorist as Ted was in this episode. How on earth did this episode convince you that Ted is worse than his ass when, to be quite honest, Barney comes off as much worse? Well, it's because season 3, episode 4 highlights a core difference in how Ted and Barney approach their relationships with women that for me means that I can be more lenient towards Barney than I am to Ted. Because you see, Barney never pretends to be anything but a complete and absolute sleazebag in the seasons of the show that we've gotten so far. His MO and motivations have always been pretty clear. He is Mr. Hit That and Bounce. That is what he's about. That is what you get with him. Nothing more, nothing less. Barney Stinson is about and for sex. Only sex. All his schemes and machinations is about having sex, a ton of it, with as many beautiful women as he can. And I know the instinctual reaction is to immediately put him in the dumpster as a result of that, because of how he goes about getting said sex, often by tricking these women into his bed, which I do not condone and I do think is pretty shitty. Yes. However, I am still of the opinion that Ted is worse, and it is simply because Barney is about having sex, yes, but as long as he's not drugging women or having sex with intoxicated women who cannot say no to him, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that doesn't actually happen in the show. The only time we see Barney with a clearly intoxicated woman was in the episode when he was trying to make a case to Lily and Marshall about renting Ted's apartment when they thought Ted was going to move in with Robin. And in that episode, the intoxicated woman he would have headed home with decided to flash the cops and was arrested for public indecency instead. But other than that, I can't recall any other woman that would not have been able to give clear consent for her relations with him in the episodes leading up to season 3, episode 4. Please correct me if I'm wrong about that in the comments. So, as I was saying, Barney is all about the sex, and sure, he is Mr. Hit It and Bounce, but I am personally of the opinion that it is not as big a deal for the women as long as it is not coerced in some way, because, I mean, we've all been there, having sex with someone who bounced almost immediately afterwards. Like, you're pissed and your pride and ego is bruised that they were just waiting to have sex with you, but you shrug and you move on. It doesn't hurt as much because you hadn't gotten to the point of being completely emotionally invested in them at that point. And we know Barney isn't the type that would wait for like 6 months to get with a girl, biding his time before hitting it and quitting. I mean, Usually, it's after a night of fun, maybe a couple of days max, but it moves way too fast for any emotions to get into that for either him or the women he's with. It speaks to his emotional unavailability and his fear of commitment, which we know is rooted in his own history and backstory, and the girlfriends that Nigerians will say showed him shaggy. Barney is a dick, yeah, and maybe I'm treating it too lightly, but it's just sex. And I've always been of the opinion that sex is not something that happens to women. To think otherwise veers into slightly misogynistic territory because women have agency and thus we can choose to partake in the act and enjoy it. As long as, I repeat, it is not coerced. Other than that, it's just sex. And sure, fucking a dirtbag like Barney can be infuriating when it's the next morning and you realize that that was all he wanted from you in the first place. But I still think that it is less of a painful ordeal for women to have sex with a scumbag who you forget in like a couple of weeks max, until you run into them in the streets a couple of months afterwards and your shoe turns into a flying projectile that hits the center of their smug face with an accuracy that makes you smile, than it is to get invested in an emotional terrorist like Ted, who would upend their entire lives and have them putting together the broken and shattered pieces of who they are after he's done with them. Like the stories about Ted and his friends, so we never actually get a view on the women that Ted dated afterwards. But just imagine, I like to think of Victoria, for example, who was trying to make her long distance relationship with Ted work. And even if it was that the planned conversation she wanted to have with Ted was to ask if they could break up or open up their relationship in some way, they still had not had that talk yet. She calls her boyfriend in the early hours of the day for him, and it is Robin, another woman, that picks up. Robin, who informs her that Ted is in her own bathroom and she should hold on. I mean, no matter why Victoria was calling, that would have shattered her way more than if it had been a hit it and quit it interaction with a man like Barney. Because I repeat, with Barney, there is no emotional commitment. With Ted, there is. And that makes all the difference for me. As we see clearly with Natalie, who he broke up with on her birthday and then sailed right back into her life again when he was going through the phase in his life where he was giving things he hadn't liked before a second chance, and waltzes in to upend poor Natalie's life only to break up with her yet again for the second time in a row on her birthday. If you had asked Natalie to choose between a dick who wants to just get into her pants, they have hot, glorious sex for a couple of hours and is out of her life immediately afterwards, or Ted Mosby with his insistent desire to mess with her emotions in a search for the one, I am sure she would choose the sex. And like I said, this episode just brings everything to stark relief for me, because let us look at things with Stacy again. Ted, in his own words, admits that he was falling for Stacy, and we can assume that Stacy was falling for him right back, because like I stated at the start of this video, Ted Mosby is pretty smart, funny, witty, cute, and tends to sweep the girlies off their feet. So you know she was buying and feeding into his sauce. And then his ass lets Barney get into his head and breaks up with Stacy as a result. A great girl that he himself admits that he had started to fall for. Like, yes, Barney was an ass in this episode, but he didn't force Ted to make that decision. That was all Ted. He planted the seed, yes, but Ted was the one who was all caught up in the misogynistic, and let's call it what it is. It was pretty damn misogynistic to be all stuck on the fact that you cannot go where your friend went first. It is a very disgusting way to look at a woman's body and sexual choices, that your friend conquered her first and so you punk out. Because let us be real, that is what happened. And you know what else we should be honest about? If the roles were reversed, Barney would not give a shit. One, because Barney is all about the sex and he would never turn down the chance to hit it, even if Ted has had sex with a woman before. And should it be a woman that by some miracle Barney has feelings for, that Ted has had sex with before he did, he would not give up either, because Barney Stinson is someone who has had sex with a ton of women and is not about to start having an issue with the woman he falls for, having had a ton of sex with other people that aren't him, even if one of said people is his best friend. And before you say that, but Noria, Barney did see a miniature Ted dancing on Stacy at the end of the episode, doesn't that imply that he too has a problem with the fact that Ted almost got together with Stacy? I would like to point out that I read that scene very differently. It wasn't a ew, Ted almost got in there. It was more, mini Ted is mocking him that he is not in any way close to winning the deal either, because Stacy is going to have him wait for months before she decides to have sex with him. That is how I read that scene of miniature Ted. That is why Ted is on Stacy's shoulder and not all up and down her body like Ted envisioned Barney doing when he, Ted, decided to step away and break up with an otherwise great gal. Now, you can say that with Stacy, Barney has spent almost a month with her at this point, and so she might end up getting emotionally attached to him as well by the time they have sex and he bounces. And yes, in that case, that would be Barney being as much of an emotional terrorist as Ted. But that only applies in that situation with Stacy. Ted, meanwhile, has done it to several more women since the show started, so he still bears the title of King Emotional Terrorist. Of course, that is just me and my thoughts on that. You are perfectly allowed to have a totally different perspective. So whether you agree with me or disagree with me, please let me know by sharing your thoughts in the comments. I love reading them. Don't forget to hit the like button if you've watched so far and haven't done so yet. Share this video if you can. Check out my gaming or ASMR channels if they sound like something you might be interested in. I have both of them linked in the description bar, and I will see you tomorrow with a new video. Until then, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.